In November 2003, a courtroom in Washington state bore witness to a sight that seemed at first like a moment of profound human tragedy. A man with a thin mustache, wearing a cheap suit and glasses, sat slumped in his chair, openly weeping. To a stranger, it looked like a man broken by grief. But as the camera panned across the room, the truth was far more terrifying. The gallery was filled with the families of 48 women, and the man in the suit, Gary Leon Ridgway, wasn't crying because he was sorry for what he had done. He was crying because he was finally forced to admit that he had spent the last 20 years treating human lives like disposable scrap metal. For 2 decades, the Pacific Northwest lived in the shadow of the Green River Killer. He was a ghost that haunted the Pacific Highway South, a predator so prolific that he didn't just break the record for serial murder in America, he doubled it. The most disturbing part of the story isn't just the body count, it's how normal Gary Ridgway was. He wasn't a charismatic genius or a sophisticated mastermind. He had an IQ of 82. He was a truck painter who never missed a day of work. He was a husband who went to church every Sunday. He was a man the police had in their sights as early as 1982. They interviewed him. They searched his home. They even took his DNA years before the technology existed to test it. And yet, for nearly 20 years, Gary Ridgway continued to punch his time card at the factory by day and return to the river by night. This is the story of the man who outran the FBI, the task force, and even the advice of Ted Bundy simply by being too boring to be a monster. This is the hunt for the Green River Killer, a 20-year game of cat and mouse where the cat was blind and the mouse was hiding in plain sight. To understand Gary Ridgway, you have to throw out everything you think you know about serial killers. He wasn't a silver-tongued charmer like Ted Bundy, and he wasn't a methodical planner like the BTK killer. Gary was, by all accounts, remarkably average. He was a man defined by a lifelong banality that acted as the perfect camouflage. Born in Salt Lake City and raised in the Pacific Northwest, Gary's childhood was far from the Hollywood origin story of a monster, but it was filled with quiet, simmering dysfunction. He struggled with a low IQ and a severe reading disability, often being mocked by his peers. But the most significant influence in his life was his mother. According to Gary, he had a love-hate relationship with her. She was a dominant, forceful woman who reportedly made Gary wash her hair and perform odd, intimate tasks. It was a dynamic that warped his view of women from a very young age, creating a deep-seated resentment that he would eventually project onto his victims. By the late 1970s and early 80s, Gary had settled into a life of absolute routine. He got a job at the Kenworth Truck Company in Renton, Washington, as a truck painter. He stayed at that same job for 30 years. He was the guy who showed up early, worked late, and never made waves. He was married 3 times, and to his neighbors, he was just Gary, the guy who kept his lawn manicured and spoke frequently about his newfound religious faith. Gary was an obsessive churchgoer. He would read the Bible aloud in his home and cry during sermons. But this wasn't a man seeking redemption, it was a man using religion as a shield. He would go to church on Sunday, and by Monday, he was cruising the Strip, the Pacific Highway South, looking for women. The Strip was a specific kind of environment. In the early 80s, it was a hub for sex work, drug use, and runaways. It was a place where people lived on the margins of society. Gary targeted these women specifically because he believed they were disposable. He once told investigators, "I picked prostitutes as my victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away or might never be reported missing." He even used his status as a family man to his advantage. Gary would keep a photo of his young son in his car or on his person. If a woman felt hesitant about getting into a stranger's vehicle, he would show her the photo to prove he was a safe, caring father. It was a chillingly effective tactic that weaponized his own child's innocence to lure women to their deaths. This is the mask of sanity that Gary Ridgway wore every single day. He wasn't a man living in the shadows. He was a man living in the light of a normal, boring working class life. While the Green River Task Force was looking for a mastermind, Gary was just painting trucks, attending Bible study, and waiting for the sun to go down. The horror officially began on a muggy afternoon in July 1982. Two boys were riding their bikes near the Green River in Kent, Washington, when they spotted something snagged on a submerged log. At first, they thought it was a discarded mannequin, but as they got closer, the reality set in. It was the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. Just days later, the river gave up more of its secrets. Four more bodies were discovered in or near the water, including 23-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner. The local news began to buzz with a name that would soon become a national headline: the Green River Killer. The Green River wasn't just a dumping ground, it was a psychological weapon. By leaving the bodies in the water or along the banks, the killer was sending a message to the city. But the police quickly realized they weren't dealing with a typical spree killer. This person was methodical. He wasn't just killing, he was banking bodies, often returning to the sites to revisit his victims, a detail that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. In response to the mounting body count, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force. It would eventually grow into the largest and most expensive task force in U.S. history. They had the best detectives, the latest computer profiling technology, and even help from the FBI's behavioral science unit. But the task force was facing an impossible math problem. Gary Ridgway was killing so frequently that by the end of 1983, the list of missing and murdered women was growing faster than the police could process the evidence. The Strip had become a conveyor belt of tragedy. The pressure on the investigators was suffocating. Every time a new body was found, the public's fear turned into anger toward the police. Why couldn't they catch him? They had a description of a primer gray pickup truck. They had witness reports of a plain-looking man. In fact, the police actually encountered Gary Ridgway very early on. In 1982, Gary's name appeared on a list of people who had been seen with one of the victims. He was brought in for questioning. He looked the detectives in the eye, gave them a calm, aw shucks explanation for why he was in the area, and they let him go. He was too ordinary. He didn't fit the profile of the maniac they were looking for. By 1984, the task force was so desperate that they decided to do the unthinkable. They reached out to a man who knew exactly how a monster thinks, because he was one. They went to Florida's death row to interview Ted Bundy. Bundy sat across from the investigators and gave them a terrifyingly accurate prediction. He told them the killer was likely a local man, someone who blended in perfectly, and someone who likely returned to the dump sites to interact with the bodies. Bundy even suggested that the police should stake out fresh grave sites to catch him in the act. It was a Silence of the Lambs moment years before the movie existed. But even with the insights of America's most famous serial killer, Gary Ridgway remained a ghost. He passed a polygraph test in 1984 through sheer, cold-blooded detachment. He moved his dumping grounds away from the river and into the deep woods, effectively going dark, while the police continued to chase shadows at the water's edge. The sleeper hadn't gone to bed, he had just changed his route. And as the 80s turned into the 90s, the Green River Task Force began to shrink. The funding dried up, and the world began to wonder if the most prolific killer in history had simply gotten away with it. By 1987, the Green River Task Force was drowning in data, but starving for a lead. They had thousands of tips, a list of suspects that could fill a stadium, and a pile of evidence that didn't point to a single person. But then, a detective named Tom Jensen who would eventually spend more time on this case than any other man, decided to circle back to an old name, Gary Leon Ridgway. The police had already questioned Gary twice before, but this time they had something more substantial. A witness had reported seeing a woman get into Gary's primer gray pickup truck shortly before she disappeared. The task force descended on Gary's home with a search warrant. They tore the place apart. They looked under the floorboards, searched his shed, and looked for trophies. They found nothing. However, they did something that day that would eventually change the course of criminal history. They took a saliva sample and a hair sample from Gary. At the time, DNA technology was in its infancy. It was a laboratory theory, not a courtroom reality. They put Gary's samples in a small plastic vial, labeled them, and placed them in an evidence locker. Gary Ridgway watched them leave his property. He didn't panic. He didn't flee the state. He simply went back to his job at the Kenworth plant. In his mind, he had already won. He had looked the law in the eyes, and they hadn't seen the monster staring back. As the late 80s bled into the 1990s, the Green River Task Force began to crumble. The funding was slashed from millions of dollars a year to just a few thousand. The elite team of detectives was reduced to a skeleton crew. For the families of the victims, the silence from the police felt like a second murder. Their daughters, sisters, and mothers were being forgotten because they were women of the street. During this decade-long conflict, Gary Ridgway continued to live his life. He got married for a third time to a woman named Judith. To her, Gary was a devoted husband who loved taking her on camping trips and yard sale hunting. But the chilling reality was that Gary was taking his wife to the same woods where he had hidden the remains of his victims. He was vacationing in his own private graveyard. Inside the evidence locker, that small vial of Gary's saliva sat for 14 years. It was a ticking time bomb for the killer, but for the detectives, it was just another cold lead. The technology needed to be born before the case could be solved. By the year 2001, forensic science had made a quantum leap. Short tandem repeat (STR) DNA testing had become the new gold standard. It was more sensitive, more accurate, and required much smaller samples than the tests of the 80s. Detective Tom Jensen, who had never let Gary's name leave his mind, sent the old saliva sample to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The wait was agonizing. For 20 years, the Green River Killer had been a phantom, a boogeyman that had eluded the FBI, the latest computers, and even the insights of Ted Bundy. But in November 2001, the lab technician called Jensen with the news that would stop the city's heart. The DNA from the 1987 saliva sample was a perfect, undeniable match to the DNA found on several of the earliest Green River victims. The ghost finally had a name. The ordinary truck painter was the most prolific serial killer in American history. But as the police prepared to move in for the arrest, a new complication arose. They had him for 4 murders, but they knew the list was much, much longer. And if they just charged him and went to trial, Gary Ridgway might take the location of dozens of missing women to his grave. The task force was about to enter into the most controversial deal in the history of the American legal system.